You are about to read an article about an amazing man named Robert Smalls, a man born into slavery, a man who took an unimaginable risk to escape to freedom. Smalls lived during one of the most troubling times in U.S. history, a time when America was almost ripped in two, a time of violence and shattered hopes. This time in history is known as the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, and now we want to take you back to that time to see how it really was. In 1839, when Robert Smalls was born, he was among the 2.5 million men, women, and children who were enslaved in America. Slaves weren't considered people. They were treated as property, and their owners could use them any way they liked. Many slaves in the South worked on huge farms called plantations, working dawn to dusk picking cotton or tobacco. Others, like young Robert Smalls and his mother, worked in their owners' homes. Smalls and his mother were lucky. Their owners treated them kindly. For most enslaved people, life was brutal and hopeless. By the early 1800s, slavery had been banned in the states of the North. But in the South, slavery remained legal. In fact, many Southerners were convinced that their way of life depended on it. And by the 1850s, the argument over slavery had become more and more fierce. America was supposed to be the home of the free. The Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. How could that be true when millions of people were enslaved? Southerners began to fear that slavery would be outlawed. And so in February of 1861, 7 Southern states decided they would create their own nation. 4 more states soon joined them. These 11 states would rip themselves away from the United States and form the Confederate States of America, a nation where slavery would be legal. President Abraham Lincoln couldn't let America be torn apart. And so the country went to war, the states of the North fighting the states of the South. And what a terrible, bloody, brutal war it was. 22-year-old Robert Smalls was forced to fight on the Southern side against the people who wanted to end slavery. This deep injustice made him long for freedom. The fighting went on for 4 years before the South finally surrendered in 1865. The United States of America had survived as one nation. Slavery was finally over. But the price had been high. 750,000 soldiers were dead. Hundreds of thousands more were horribly wounded. The South was in ruins. Its biggest cities burned to the ground. The once elegant Southern way of life had ended. Many people were left with nothing. And as though life could not get any more hopeless, another tragedy happened just 5 days after the end of the war. President Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed by a Southerner named John Wilkes Booth. But at least there was one thing to celebrate: the end of slavery. Freedom brought relief and joy to former slaves, who were now called freedmen and freedwomen. In the first years after the war, there was a great burst of hope. The U.S. government sent the army to the South to help rebuild and to protect freed slaves. Northerners rushed to the South to open schools. The government passed new laws giving former slaves the same rights as white people, including the right to vote. Hundreds of former slaves were voted into office, including Robert Smalls. He was elected to the U.S. Congress 5 times. After centuries of slavery, it seemed that black people in the South would be equal to white people. But in reality, life was extremely difficult for the newly free. Hatred and prejudice smoldered in the South. Southerners had fought for 4 years to keep slavery legal. Many unfairly blamed former slaves for the Civil War. Hatred erupted into violence, and groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who were determined to keep former slaves from ever achieving equality, spread terror. Within 10 years, the promises of that hopeful time were shattered. Southern states passed laws that made it very difficult for former slaves to vote, to become educated, to lead lives that were truly free. For the next 100 years, there would be no equality for blacks in the South. And even in the North, they often faced discrimination and hatred. Keep all of this in your mind as you read the Storyworks article, Freedom or Death. Think about the hardships Robert Smalls faced. He was born into slavery. He was forced to fight in a brutal war. He endured terrible hatred and prejudice, even as a free man. And yet, as you will read, Robert Smalls found the courage to lead his family to freedom and to continue fighting for equality throughout his life.